Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's Boshell lecture on modern deconstructions and reconstructions of ancient Nimrud. I am Julia Marchari-Alexander. I'm the Andrea B. and John H. Laporte Director of the museum, and we are very excited to have you today, and what a terrific crowd. This is the biggest crowd that I've been with since COVID, so yay you, woohoo! All right, now it gets tricky because I have to use this. Let's see. Oh, there we go. So as you all know, you who have been with us for a while, we are really dedicated to continuing and broadening the kind of work that we do to understand the histories of the people whose objects we steward and the histories of those objects that we steward as well. And in order to do that, we need to really create awareness around the objects that we have here in this collection, an awareness that is about how we can think about our present moment in the context of what has led us here. So I want to make sure to begin today's lecture, as we do with all public lectures, by reading our Indigenous Land and Cultural Heritage Acknowledgement. The Walters Art Museum acknowledges the Piscataway and Susquehannock nations that originally inhabited this land. We acknowledge tribal nations, most notably the Lumbee, who migrated here, and indigenous peoples whose ancestors are represented in the objects that we steward in our collection. Our program, as I said at the beginning, is this afternoon Modern Deconstructions and Reconstructions of Ancient Nimrud. This is part of a semi-annual Boshell lecture series, and for those of you who, for whom I called it biannual in the past, I'm thinking about Venice, that's every other year. The Boshells have very, very generously created a lecture that allows us to have 2 lectures per year. So I want to say thank you to Betsy and her family. This series began in 2017 and over time has really given us some incredible opportunities to invite internationally renowned speakers, such as those we have here today. And these speakers present on our platforms, both on-site and online. The lectures are free, and the presentations connect us to the art of the ancient world through examinations of ancient topics and contemporary topics together. So on behalf of the staff and the Board of Trustees, I want to take a minute just to thank the Boshell Foundation, and there are a few members of the foundation who are here today. So I hope we can all put our hands together and say thank you. Art. Today's program focuses issues on the Neo-Assyrian site of Nimrud, otherwise known as ancient Kalhu, and that is a site that has suffered grievously in the past, and particularly since 2015. Contemporary reconstructions in museum contexts have brought and continue to bring new life and meaning to the ancient remains. And today we have 2 speakers who will share their thoughts about issues of cultural preservation and how these remains inspire artists and curators today. So first off, I have the honor of introducing one of our esteemed guest speakers, Dr. Katharyn Hanson. Dr. Hanson will be sharing historical information about Nimrud and her own archaeological perspective on the present-day site, which is in Iraq, and she will also talk about what has happened to some of the objects that have been preserved. Dr. Hanson is a Smithsonian Secretary Scholar, say that quickly 10 times, and a Cultural Heritage Preservation Scholar at the Museum Conservation Institute. She works as an archaeologist specializing in the protection of cultural heritage. She received her doctorate from the University of Chicago with a dissertation entitled Considerations of Cultural Heritage, Threats to Mesopotamian Archaeological Sites. Previously, she held a visiting research position with the Geospatial Technologies Team at the American Association for the Advancement of Sciences, and postdoctoral fellowships at the University of Pennsylvania Museum and MCI. She directs archaeological site preservation training at the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil, Iraq, a program with which this institution has a very long history. And I just want to say, Terry Draymond-Weiser, many of you remember her. She was the head of conservation for many years, and she worked with the Iraqi Institute for the Conservation of Antiquities and Heritage in Erbil. And I think it's just terrific that we're tying our own institutional past with your present. So that's really, really, really great. Dr. Hanson has been involved in various archaeological fieldwork, and she serves on the board of the Academic Research Institute in Iraq. She has been doing fieldwork and projects for over 25 years and curated museum exhibitions and published on damage to ancient sites in Iraq and Syria. Her research, about which you will hear some today, combines field archaeology, remote sensing, and cultural heritage protection methodology and policy with on-the-ground action to protect that culture. Our second esteemed guest speaker is Dr. Kiersten Neumann, who will be connecting Nimrud to contemporary displays in museums. She'll share about her recent work redisplaying the reliefs from Nimrud and how the objects from this site play a role in the work of living artists, such as Michael Rakowitz. Did I say that one correctly? Michael Rakowitz. Dr. Kiersten Neumann is curator at the Oriental Institute Museum, as well as an Oriental Institute Research Associate. I need new glasses. And a lecturer on Near Eastern art and archaeology in the Department of Art History at the University of Chicago. She received her Ph.D. from the University of California, Berkeley, and was awarded the American Academic Research Institute in Iraq Donnie George Ukana Dissertation Prize for the best U.S. doctoral dissertation on ancient Iraq. She is co-editor of the Rutledge Handbook of the Senses in the Ancient Near East and has published numerous articles on sensory experience, ritualized practice, and material culture of the first millennium BCE, as well as museum practice, collecting histories, and the reception of Assyrian and Achaemenid. Did I do that okay? This is full of tricky words. Achaemenid art. There's a test at the end. Pronunciation and topic content. So at the OI Museum, Kiersten has curated such exhibitions as Persepolis, Images of an Empire, Joseph Lyndon Smith, the Persepolis paintings, and Making Sense of Marbles, Roman sculpture at the OI. She also has looked at and reconstructed the permanent galleries as part of a complete renovation of the institution's collection. Following the presentation of these amazing speakers, we will have an opportunity to hear them in conversation, moderated by our very own Dr. Lisa Anderson-Zhu, who is Associate Curator of Art and of the Ancient Mediterranean at the Walters. This conversation is going to be connecting the two perspectives of our two speakers, and it will also kick off a Q&A with all of you. So, after all of that, which I am looking very, very, very much forward to, please join us for a reception on the first level there, or is it down here or up there? Up here. And I just really, really encourage you to sit back and enjoy today's program. It will be spectacular. So, Dr. Hanson.
Thank you. Before I begin, I especially want to thank the staff here for organizing today. I'm delighted to be able to join you, and if you give me just a moment to set a timer so I don't speak for too long, I can get a little excited about this. We could be here all day. So I'm delighted to be joining you today to talk about Nimrud, which is pictured here on the satellite image. It is an enormous site. The red arrows there on the right, they're the sort of the northeast corner of a massive ancient city wall. It encircled over 360 hectares. And today we'll be focusing on the Nimrud citadel, which is that arrow there on the left. As you all likely know, Nimrud is in Iraq. It's about 20 kilometers south of modern Mosul. It's known in the biblical tradition as Kala, or Kalhu, and it was once the capital of a Neo-Assyrian empire that, at its height, around 800 BC or so, stretched from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Mediterranean Sea. As this lavish capital city, Nimrud citadel in particular included temples, palaces, elaborate monumental buildings, and a ziggurat. Typically when I talk about Nimrud, I like to say that it was Rome before there was Rome. And this is the seat of a very impressive empire, and it was gathering all those luxury items there. Over the past 150 years or so, the site has been excavated repeatedly, and some of the most famous archaeological artifacts from Iraq, including fine luxury goods, these monumental reliefs and sculptures, like you see in the collection here, come from that site. Objects from Nimrud are in museums around the globe, and there's just a wealth and density of things at Nimrud itself. There we go. Prior to damage by ISIS, Nimrud was typically a local tourist stop. Every sixth grader in Mosul would have gone to visit at some point. It was something that connected the community and the area to the ancient past, and a point of local pride. Here you see Zaid Ghazi. He's the current director of the Mosul Cultural Museum, and he's also the head of the Iraqi Nimrud rescue team. And this is him on site there on the left prior to any destruction there, showing his conservation work at the site. And then on the right, you see the zoomed-in satellite image from 2014. And the bulk of what we'll be talking about today is the Northwest Palace on the Citadel, and that's where that red arrow is pointing to. So these are stills from an ISIS propaganda video, which is why I'm not giving photo credit up there. And these show barrel bombs and the reliefs being hacked apart by ISIS. It was first publicized in 2015 through these ISIS propaganda videos. Damage at the site included sledgehammers, jackhammers, earth-moving equipment used to deface and chop up the ancient carved reliefs. Later, in the spring of 2015, 2015, ISIS detonated barrels of explosives in the Northwest Palace, destroying any standing remains that were in that part. So all those barrels, those phosphate bombs, that's what that explosion then looked like later. In 2016, ISIS blew up another gate, not part of the Northwest Palace, but further on the site. They damaged a temple, and in September and October of 2016, ISIS leveled the ziggurat there, which is the human-made mound at the top of the site. And they leveled it with earth-moving equipment, destroying a section of another temple next to it, and then they mined the area on top of it. And one of the biggest concerns when works first started back at the site was if the mines extended throughout the rest of the site, how much of the site had been mined, and how was that mining going to get cleared in the least destructive way. So here you see a push pile of some of the remains from that destruction. This is a lamasu. Lamasu are human-headed winged bulls, colossal sculptures. And this one is hacked to bits. You can see in the front there are its paws. And it was pushed together right in front of the reconstructed entrance to the palace. And it wasn't just destruction, but also erosion. And you see here in these examples, most of the sculptures in the Northwest Palace, as are the ones here in this collection, are made out of a material typically known as Mosul marble, which is actually a type of gypsum, which means that it's a relatively soft stone. It's quite at risk for erosion, any water damage, and fluctuations in temperature. So you can see some of that type of damage there. The other thing I want to highlight with this slide is that there are still things at the site. One of the first questions I always get about any work I do in Iraq is like, well, is there anything left? It's like, well, yes, obviously. There's all of the unexcavated material below, which is being preserved in situ, and then there are plenty of fragments. You know, they might not be standing sculptures anymore, but they certainly are fragments there. And so, to that end, the area was retaken by coalition forces in November of 2016. And at that point, conversations started between the Iraqi Ministry of Culture and the Smithsonian, and specifically the Iraqi Ministry of Culture's wing called the State Board of Antiquities and Heritage. And they asked the Smithsonian for assistance. And part of this assistance was to help them with the site of Nimrud. And so these meetings were held, prioritization was discussed, and out of this, the Nimrud Rescue Team was created. This is a 20-person group of cultural heritage professionals who are based in Mosul, who Smithsonian's worked with collaboratively to prioritize what type of training they would like, to ensure that they get the training and the supplies, and the ability to do field seasons on the site, picking up the pieces. And one of the biggest parts of this is making sure these pieces are picked up systematically. Here you see the grid overlay on the satellite image of the Northwest Palace after its destruction, and then you see a training exercise on the ground at the Iraqi Institute in Erbil, Iraq. And this grid, which was developed for a First Aid for Culture course, the system was designed for museums in times of crisis, and it has actually, for our methodology at Nimrud, been paired with methodology typically used for archaeological survey work. And in doing this, we're able to systematically document where each of the pieces of rubble comes from. So, as promised, what's been happening on the site these days? And there's been 2 field seasons, 2018, 2019 field season, and then another one from 2019, 2020, with a long pause. But the work thus far is best described by these 3 pictures here. In the top left there, you see the storage facility that was constructed specifically to house the remains so that they would not be subject to the weathering and temperature fluctuations as much. And then those crates down there on the bottom left, you see those holding material from each of the squares, so that ideally when they want to reconstruct things, they're going to be able to go back and see what was there. A lot of this also has to do with documenting a crime. It's pretty unlikely at this point, though we don't know for sure, that war crimes prosecutions will happen. But intentional damage is intentional damage, and it is a war crime. And so one way to collect evidence for that is to gather the damage that's taken place on the site. So it's another reason why we're making sure everything is photographed and collected systematically. On the right there, you see shoring up and protecting. The work that's been done to protect the sculptural fragments in situ has been really crucial. And so this is a geotextile being covered by dirt and modern mud brick that are next to it to protect the sculpture that remains in situ, so that it can stay in its original place without further damage until they're able to get roofing onto it. This I should point out, is Zaid Ghazi, who we saw earlier, who's the director of this team, and he's pictured here also with the shovel. And it's his story that I want to highlight, because he's the one who has been organizing his team, getting them out into the field, and really making sure that they're able to do the work in documenting this before anything happens to the site further. So one of the things I also want to point out is that as this picture shows walking through the mud brick collapse, much of the visible damage is actually reconstructed modern mud brick, but then that was paired with the ancient sculptural reliefs next to it. And so what they're trying to do in the recovery effort is make sure that any ancient mud brick, any ancient artifacts are pulled out and recovered, and clear the way so that this modern mud brick that was done in the 90s is pushed aside. And I think with my remaining minute and my final slide here, I want to tell you that I look at a lot of images of destruction in my job. A lot of what I work on is cultural heritage preservation broadly, and for Syria and Iraq, sometimes that can be very depressing. And if I look at these images of this push pile, for instance, at the Slamasu, and this is the one where you can see the pause right there, this is heavy. This is damage to some of the soul of heritage, what we think of as our history, right? Iraqi's history, humanity's history. And this push pile here has now been covered. It's okay. It's protected. And when I look at pictures like this now, I focus on my colleagues who are back here. All those yellow vests, that's the Mosul-based Nimrud rescue team. And they're out there going through checkpoints, going back into the field this spring, probably a couple of weeks actually. And they're literally picking up the pieces of their past so that it can be protected and preserved for the future. And with that, I'm going to thank you for your attention, and I'm going to pass it over to Kiersten. Thank you.
Thank you, Katharyn. And I'd also like to start by thanking the museum team and the Boshell Foundation for the opportunity to participate in today's program. Okay. I'm showing a plan of both the citadel of Kalhu, denoting the location of the Northwest Palace, and to the right, a palace plan based on over a century of excavations, which together have revealed the footprint of this overtly conspicuous building project of King Ashurnasirpal II. Organized around the palace's open-air courtyards were rooms devoted to courtly activities, including a throne room and reception rooms where the king received visitors, banqueting rooms, areas for ritualized practice, and private residential quarters. Large-scale carved stone panels, a defining feature of Assyrian palaces, were mounted onto the lower walls of the courtyard facades and the more public interior rooms. These non-portable works of art, crafted of gypsum and colorfully painted by expert craftsmen, presented royal and mythological figures and motifs and narrative scenes of military campaigns, the presentation of tribute, and hunting expeditions. Alongside wall paintings and elaborate wooden ceilings, the reliefs enlivened the built landscape with artistic elements that embodied the official ideology and culture of Assyria, as demonstrated by this rendering of an imaginary Assyrian palace by British archaeologist Austen Henry Layard of the mid-19th century. Layard was among the first to excavate Assyrian palaces, including the Northwest Palace, and he and his successors extracted and shipped much of this sculpture to the UK and further afield in the 19th century. From that time through the present, Assyrian artifacts have traveled the world, leaving Iraq through both sanctioned and illegal export. Today, most Kalhu reliefs are housed in private collections and public institutions in the global north, including these two panels in the care of the Walters Art Museum. Both show mythological guardian figures with purifier and bucket in hand, figures that are called Kalhu in Akkadian, the administrative language of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. They originally flanked doorways in Room P and Room G, spaces first excavated by Layard. Of the Room G reliefs, Layard wrote the following, quote, the colors still adhered to the sandals, brows, hair, and eyes. The sculptures were in the best state of preservation. The most delicate carvings were still distinct, and the outline of the figures retained its original sharpness. As discussed by Katharyn, a selection of reliefs also remained in situ in Kalhu, standing tall for millennia until 2015. Much like Layard's drawings and countless studies of the Northwest Palace reliefs that have spanned centuries, many approaches have been taken to document, remember, and reconstruct this lost heritage. One approach is found right here in Baltimore, a plaster cast. This panel, showing an Kalhu and stylized tree, is mounted on the exterior wall of the Monroe Street United Methodist Church. The Invisible Enemy Should Not Exist, the project of Iraqi-American artist Michael Rakowitz, presents yet another response. Since 2018, Michael and his studio team, working out of Chicago, have focused on reappearing the relief program of the Northwest Palace, room by room, in the exact architectural footprint of each, including this reappearance of Room G at Malbo Kunsthal in Sweden, and panel 13 of the same room at the OI Museum in Chicago. This reappearance, united with an original fragment in the care of the OI, has been a highlight of our Assyrian galleries since 2019, installed in the recently renovated museum and in time for the OI's centennial celebrations. Michael describes these things as, quote, ghosts, as a kind of spectral presence, not a reconstruction, but a reappearance. They can haunt, but for the person that misses the object that became the ghost, they can also reassure, end quote. This is not the first time that we've worked with Michael, however, nor his first connection with the OI overall. And here I will take a brief step back to the beginnings of The Invisible Enemy Shall Not Exist. The OI held importance for Michael prior to moving to Chicago in 2006, an appreciation rooted in the OI's Lost Treasures of Iraq information webpage. Created in response to the looting of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad in the aftermath of the US-led invasion in 2003, the page offered photographs and object descriptions of the museum's collection, much of which was damaged, destroyed, or of unknown status, sourced from scholars, expeditions, and archives around the world, including those of the OI from its own expeditions, and Michael himself, who sourced Iraqi Airways timetables with pictures of the museum's objects. Researching the OI database, Michael began to imagine these objects coming back as ghosts. But like any ghost, Michael says, these objects would have to look different in order to properly haunt. And so began The Invisible Enemy Shall Not Exist, a title that comes from a translation of Aj Ibur Shapu, the name of the processional way that led through the Ishtar Gate into Babylon. Here I'm showing the project's first exhibition. These sculptures stand not simply as replicas of looted artifacts, but as surrogates of human lives that cannot be reconstructed, as ghosts of lost Iraqis similarly unable to return. Their size and attributes are the same, but the material is different. Created of papier-mâché, wrapped in the packaging of Middle Eastern food products and Arabic language newspapers common to diaspora households, they represent connection, but also fragility, a reappearing of artifacts, yet invulnerable materials that will disappear again, as any good ghost should. In 2014, working with then Chief Curator Jack Green, Michael exhibited a selection of reappeared sculptures in the OI Museum's Mesopotamian Gallery alongside artifacts from the OI's expeditions in Iraq, a connection between past and present. From 2018 to 2020, Michael's reappearance of a lamassu from the Nergal Gate of the Syrian city of Nineveh, also destroyed by ISIS in 2015, stood as London's fourth plinth commission in Trafalgar Square, constructed of colorful date syrup cans to withstand the elements. In researching how to reappear this sculpture, Michael reached out to the OI, and I was able to provide him with dimensions of the Nineveh sculpture, what proved to be a perfect fit for the fourth plinth. Since that time, I've continued to work with Michael and his studio team in researching exact measurements, excavation history, provenance, and current location of the reliefs as their focus shifted to reappearing the Northwest Palace at Kalhu. First, they reappeared Room N, a niche at the end of a royal reception room where panels were decorated with a figure of the king and alternating apkallu and stylized trees. In reconstructing a space of hospitality and refuge, Michael notes, these iterations seek to be site-specific, presented at a time when those fleeing ancient cities like Nineveh and Kalhu are still searching for safety and rest. Room N was exhibited at Art Basel in 2018, shown here on top. Below is Room F, on view at Jane Lombard Gallery in 2020. Ongoing polychromy studies being carried out by scholars provide inspiration for the vibrant colors of the reappearances of the reliefs that were destroyed or damaged in 2015, made possible with continued use of Middle Eastern food packaging and newspaper clippings as their skin. Contrasting this are blackened areas and full empty spaces, which mark sections and panels respectively that have been dispersed earlier. Labels that mimic accession cards provide information on the panels being reappeared. The panel number, current location, year excavated, year acquired, and provenance. Sections missing or in situ in 2015 are noted as such. To quote Michael, "The aim is to place the viewer in the position of an Iraqi who might have been in the palace the day before it was destroyed and seen the gaps that were left behind. It is a palimpsest of different moments of removal. It doesn't begin and end with ISIS's destruction." Quotes called from the press of individuals responding to or trying to mitigate the looting further mark the labels. Fragments of conversations, of loss and recovery, of past and present. Here, I'm showing the label for panel G13 at Malmo, a space that was uniquely left blank at this venue, its reappearance destined instead for the OI Museum. The same type of label accompanies the reappearance in the Syrian galleries. Here, Michael provided two quotes. The first is the same as the Malmo label, on the destruction of the winged bull, the missing heads of bearded figures, and the explosion of the palace. The second is of Sheikh Khalid al-Jabouri, a local commander from Nimrud, whose messages of loss appeared in several media reports after the destruction. Beside the label is a second label, which I created to align with our standard didactics, and which includes a photo of a comparable relief from Room G, now in the Metropolitan Museum in New York. The invitation we extended to Michael was to reunite a reappearance of this panel with the original fragment of the king's head, which the OI received from the British Museum in 1974. Here, the contours of gypsum meet that of the reappearance, jagged edges that place the past and present in direct conversation in an uncomfortable way, the artifact and the ghost. While it might seem at odds with Michael's work to collaborate with a place that displays archaeological objects from Iraq, he said it is the opportunity to work with the people of the Institute that is most important to him, and our mutual curiosity, that we invite him as an artist and not just his artwork. This reappearance in Chicago is meaningful for Michael in an additional way. Quote, "When I moved to Chicago from New York in 2006, I had no idea of the large and long-standing Assyrian community in Chicagoland. Coming from a Baghdadi Jewish family that fled Iraq in the 1940s, I have found that our shared histories, our grief for what we left behind, and the joy of our continuation and survival binds us." The addition of the reappearance is the latest evolution in the Syrian galleries, which stretch back to the museum's opening in 1931. From 1929 to 1935, the OI's Iraq expedition excavated the Assyrian city of Durjarukin, modern Khorsabad, and received from the Department of Antiquities of Iraq through the system of partage, or the division of finds, a fragmented lamassu and a selection of relief panels from King Sargon II's palace. Upon arriving in Chicago, the lamassu was restored at the end of the North Gallery, and the panels were set up in alcoves in the Assyrian Hall. Here, the extracted panels were presented as isolated works of art in a typical Western style, their modern cut edges set against the light gallery walls, creating the frame. And their original programmatic arrangement, experiential potential, was lost. In the 1990s, a project was undertaken at the OI to deinstall, relocate, and recontextualize the reliefs, allowing for a display that gives visitors a sense of what it would have been like to stand in the Assyrian palace over 2,700 years ago. Here I'm showing the reinstallation of the sculpture from the throne room facade. As part of our most recent gallery renovations, I created this panel to add further contextualization. I included a section called Stop the Looting that remarks on ISIS's destruction of Assyrian capital cities and presents a photo of a comparable sculpture fragment seized by Homeland Security investigations in New York in 2008 and returned to Iraq in 2015. Here I'm showing relief panels from two interior rooms of the palace as they're arranged today in their original sequence. It is opposite these installations that the Panel G reappearance stands, the latest in the evolution of the Syrian galleries. A ghost of the original and placeholder for those human lives that cannot be reconstructed, This piece connects artifacts and visitors to the present, to the loss and the ongoing threats to cultural heritage, both immaterial and material. When the Wellen Museum exhibited Room H, its director Tracy Adler said of the reappearances, quote, "These apparitions entreat us to focus on our shared humanity and build a more just future." The statues of divine attendants that stand to its right evoke another story of fragments. Excavated, broken, and damaged by fire, but almost complete in the Nabu Temple at Dur-Sharaqin, the fragments were sent to the OI as part of the division of finds and were reassembled for display in the museum. Not a full reconstruction, but a shadow of their original selves, lacking their brightly painted surfaces and supported by modern materials. As for the invisible enemy should not exist, it, like the Assyrian galleries, continues to evolve. This installation in Dubai of Section 1 of Room S, marked the change of the name from Northwest Palace of Nimrud to Northwest Palace of Kalhu, in recognition of the historical name for the Assyrian city. Michael and his team have also expanded the material used for the reappearances to include a greater linguistic presence. Languages reflect the porous boundaries of the region, like the contours of a map. Here, I'm showing the additional use of cuttings from Nineveh magazine, published by the Assyrian Foundation of America in Berkeley, California. Now, modern Assyrian is visible alongside Arabic and Akkadian, the latter language being written in the cuneiform script using gold wrappings and bouillon cubes. And so the project goes on as Michael and his team work their way through the Northwest Palace, in addition to the long-term goal of reappearing the thousands of looted objects from the Iraq Museum, which Michael acknowledges may very well outlive him. And here I would like to end by acknowledging the full team assisting Michael, named on this slide, and thank them and Michael for the opportunity to work with them for these many years, and also to Michael for speaking with me in preparations for today's event. And last, to the OI Museum team, especially Jean Evans, then Deputy Director and Chief Curator at the OI Museum, who made the reappearance of panel G13 possible. Thank you.
Now, I'd like to bring this back to Baltimore and also make it a little bit more personal. So every day when I drive home from the museum, I drive locally rather than take 95. And I go by this church in West Baltimore. I have to admit, I didn't notice at first, but one day I was driving by and it was like, there's a full-scale Neo-Assyrian relief outside this church. What is going on here? So the church appears to be boarded up. The Monroe Street United Methodist Church is at the corner of Monroe Street and Ramsey Street. And I did spend some time, every day I drive by it, and I'm like, how am I gonna get that? Who owns that? Who do I even need to talk to about it? And I had that little covetousness to my thoughts. But I also noticed as I drove by, there was very frequently a mobile van there. And I would see residents lined up next to the Kalhu, basically, who's a figure of protection, who's sprinkling something that's protective, fertility. He's definitely a symbol of something really positive and benevolent. I mean, I would see people lined up, waiting to go into the van, basically being blessed by him. So I thought, well, this is really interesting. I wonder what's going on here. So the Baltimore City Department of Health, their Community Risk Reduction Services, holds a needle exchange program at this site 3 days a week, Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, on multiple occasions, where they seek to reduce HIV, hepatitis C, and other infectious diseases from circulating due to unclean syringes. So they exchange syringes, but they also do treatment, or they do, counseling about treatment options, and just really provide a really positive service for free every week to the people of Baltimore. And so I have a different perspective on this, where this is really where it should be. And it's sort of touching to me, the idea that this figure here is blessing people, this figure from a ruin, essentially. And it's also a ruined ruin. is blessing people as they go in to try to rebuild themselves. So I do hope that it stays there forever. But another interesting thing about the reliefs, we didn't talk too much about it. So Neo-Assyrian rulers are really bombastic with some of the things that they say. And the inscriptions, this is called Ashurnasirpal's standard inscription. This appears on every relief at Nimrud. It's 22 lines of cuneiform going over his greatness, all the lands that he has conquered, all the things that he has done. And it ends in a way that I find very curious and interesting, and I'll just read you what I have up here on the slide. The city of Kalhu of old, which Shalmaneser had built, this city had become dilapidated and lay dormant. I took people that I had conquered from lands over which I gained dominion, and I settled them there. I cleared away the old ruined hill and dug down to water level. I sank the foundation pit down to a depth of 120 layers of brick. I founded a palace of cedar, cypress, juniper, boxwood, terebinth, and tamarisk as my royal residence, and for my lordly leisure for eternity. I made replicas of beasts of mountains and seas in white limestone and alabaster, and stationed them at the doors. I decorated the palace in splendid fashion. I surrounded it with knobbed nails of bronze. I hung doors of cedar, cypress, and juniper in its doorways. I took great quantities of silver, gold, tin, bronze, iron, spoils from lands over which I had gained dominion, and I put them within. So I love the fact that he starts out that, in the 9th century BC, when he gets there, it's a ruin. And he brings in all of this great wealth, and he builds it into this massive, wonderful palace, the capital of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. And thinking about the site as it is today, I think about the centuries, the millennia, the different sort of moments that it's experienced. And so sort of setting up the question that I hope we'll start our discussion with, while Katharyn said that she thinks of Nimrud as Rome before there was Rome, I think of Rome in terms of the fact that it was this great capital that parts of it fell into ruin, and then it comes back to be a great capital, and people re-inhabit it, and they live amongst the ruins in a different way. But I also think of Baltimore, and when I drive through West Baltimore, and I see these really beautiful old buildings that are in ruins, and I wonder if Baltimore can be the new Rome that comes back. But then can Baltimore be the new Nimrud? And so sort of looking at what the site has been and what it is now, the question is what it will be in the future. So I'm going to invite my Katharyn and Kiersten to come onto the stage so that we can have a little bit of a conversation before we open it up to questions. So please come. No, we'll keep it on this for now. Please feel free to sort of start talking about, any thoughts that you might have of like what the future is for the site and for the objects that remain within Iraq, but also in museums throughout the world.
Sure. For the site itself, it's going to take generations of work to document and stabilize what's been damaged so far. So that's not a short fix by any stretch. There's a lot that still needs to be done, and there's efforts right now to have the site develop a visitor center of some sort, perhaps. There's some efforts to work on some rebuildings. Whether or not that might be premature is unclear. So, I think there's a lot that still needs to be done and is going on. But it certainly is still a site very much of significance. It's, in fact, it's not just the citadel, the entirety of the area is still reserved and protected. And then the site itself, it hasn't become a tourist destination. There isn't really the local tourism the same way there used to be. But I think that is going to start changing. I think there's a real drive for people to see these sites and see them in a way that shows resiliency.
Yeah, I think, is this on? There we go. Speaking to that same concept of resiliency and longevity, much like what Michael is doing, I think there's the opportunity to engage with the materials that are currently in the diaspora in a way that extends the timeline and grows awareness that while the Neo-Assyrian Empire might have ended around 610 BCE, that wasn't the end of this site, and that it has this continued history and this continued meaning for the generations of people who have lived in its vicinity, who have engaged with it. And I think that speaks something to, we were speaking to earlier about, if you are to restore the site, if you are to recreate it, what time period do you choose? And I think that question in itself really pushes back against our idea that this was solely a Neo-Assyrian site and that it ceased to develop. And I think that's an opportunity to engage with this material in diaspora in a new way.
And then another question that I sort of grapple with is, I think, we're talking a lot about Nimrud. It's sort of like, well, why Nimrud? Why choose this site for destruction, or maybe why the Neo-Assyrian sites? But also, why focus on it for the reconstructions in the same way?
For the destruction side of things, having been in Iraq quite a bit, having seen and studied some of the other areas of destruction, there's an argument that it is against sort of like the ISIS destruction was in response to sort of the colonialism of these sites being venerated by the West. And that certainly is a component, but I think that is too simplistic a narrative for just the only reason. And really, my Iraqi colleagues have articulated this far better than I ever will. There's quite a bit about the pluralism of the present in religious practice that ISIS was trying to destroy, and the same goes for the past. So if you want a narrative about the way the world is according to ISIS's rather narrow belief system, it doesn't have a space for a pluralism of the past. And Nimrud and a lot of these other major sites that are considered sort of monumental, part of what it is to be considered Iraqi in some ways, that they make up a nationalistic Iraqi past and a heritage that's been used for that purpose, that ISIS was in many ways trying to remove that pluralism.
I mean, historically, thinking about the Neo-Assyrian period, the site of Kalhu was particularly important. While it was the first administrative imperial capital city, and that did shift later to Dur-Sharqin and then Nineveh, the site of Kalhu continued to be a site of administration and occupation. It was also a site that was used for burials for the queens and elite women. So it too, had a longer time period in history, and I think that speaks to its ongoing importance too.
I mean, I also wonder more about like Michael's kind of reconstructions. In a different lecture that he gave, he talked about how Donnie George was giving tours of his reconstructions as though they were the real thing. And looking at part of the reason I wore my very bright dress was thinking about the very colorful, engaging, lively colors that he puts into his reconstructions. And I wonder, as nothing lasts forever. Think in geological terms, like even the rocks, carved rocks won't last forever. So these things, we're already seeing how they disappear, and we have the ghosts coming back. And I wonder, are these going to be influencing in the future how people conceptualize or visualize the Neo-Assyrian Empire and how they think about it and how they teach about it?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, the reaction that people have to such a colorful piece, the reappearance being in the Syrian galleries, is quite wonderful. And in the area, we do have other reconstructions on some of the labels, in a case on Royal Building, but it's smaller scale. Right. And the reliefs from Dur-Sharqin do have traces of pigment on them that has been preserved, but you really have to point it out and say, look down here at this little sandal or on the tree. So it is a really nice reminder that, what was experienced in antiquity was quite different. And I think, what I was speaking about with Michael's work and how it forces us to think about the immaterial and the people and the loss of Iraqi history as well, that it, connects that to a more lively understanding. Like, it kind of spurs you to think about something more than just a static material object.
And do we think we'll ever visit virtual Nimrud in a virtual reality setting, or a holographic Nimrud on the site, or in other I've at the National Geographic did a virtual reconstruction of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in DC. I wonder, do you think
there have been projects. I'm sure there will be more. It's an incredibly famous site, and there's lots of folks who have worked on various ways to digitally restore, digitally archive, and then have access to that. I think making sure that both that digital archive and the storage and all of that is accessible, particularly from Iraq, would probably be the key in that. And I don't know that that's been the case for a lot of these things thus far. I don't know if they're at a point where the site could have sort of your own VR goggles situation. Right. But I do think that there is a place for technology as this goes forward. I mean, we're certainly using it to document the damage that's happened, and I think that while I can't guess how technology is going to be used, say 5 years from now, and what's happening at the site, I do think there's certainly a place for that as it goes forward.
All right, I am going to open it up to audience questions now. So it's hard to see up top where everyone is, but you raise your hand and Janelle or Paloma will bring you a microphone. Let's see, who's fastest? We've got a runner up there. Okay, Janelle's running. We've got one down here.
Shall I wait? Go ahead?
Go ahead.
Okay, thank you. I'm wondering what both of you have found to be the reaction of the current population of Iraq to, I don't mean the specialists in the field, but just the people who still live there, to this drive to preserve. Are they very involved? Do they know about it? What the reaction is?
I can speak for my project, and I'll be very honest. There's been quite a bit of frustration with how slow we are. I think a lot of folks would like the site to have been cleaned up like a year ago, and the idea of systematic, slow documentation is annoying. It doesn't show the resiliency of the people who are, back to life, back to working very hard. Instead it shows the slow documentation of what's happening at the site. So there isn't something big and fancy and rebuilt yet. And so I think there's been a lot of frustration about that. And that's about as honest as I can be with that. And we've been rightly criticized for, we're a big institution, and there's been a lot of bureaucracy, both on the Smithsonian side and on the Iraqi side, and trying to get stuff moving and done. There's other projects at the site. UNESCO built a fence and stuff like that, but none of the projects thus far have been something that have really shown what a lot of your average local person who lives in the village next door is going to want to show off about the site. I do think that there's been a lot of excitement about work happening at the site again, and I think that's about it for my answer. Yeah.
I think, yep.
Hello. I had a question about, this might be the wrong time period, the Mesopotamian goddess Inanna. Is she in any of the ruins?
Sorry, I didn't quite catch that. Is she in the ruins?
Yeah, is she referenced anywhere?
There's a temple to Ishtar right there, yeah. So that's just down and off the ziggurat.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, the Northwest Palace within the same building had a temple complex connected to it that had a number of temples of different gods. There is theories that one of the reliefs in one of the rooms in the more ritual suites of the palace did have an image of a female Kalhu, potentially a goddess. So some do think that might be Ishtar. That is the only example of a female figure that we have in that Kalhu form with the wings. So she might have also been in the reliefs.
That's very cool. Was there another question down here? Yep, in the front.
Good afternoon and welcome for your interesting presentations. I'm new to all of this and I was looking at the relief And I know there's a lot of symbolism in it. I'm wondering if we could go back a slide and just talk about that a little bit.
Let's see. For this one, just the very basics of it are that there's a sacred tree, and the Kalhu is winged here, but very muscled and wearing courtly garments, and he has a bucket of pollen, correct? And a pine cone that he's using to pollinate the tree, and he'll also use it to pollinate other people. And now I rely on the two of you to fill in the rest.
Yeah, so the figure is an Kalhu. They're a mythological sage that is believed to be descendant in terms of their wisdom and knowledge from the god Ea, who's a god of fresh water and wisdom. And then this figure is a divine figure, and in between, and then we have Umanu, who are human experts or masters in their craft. And they are believed to also get their wisdom and knowledge from that Kalhu, from Ea. So it's kind of this, which is really nice to think about the palaces, and those would have been the experts that were creating these panels and creating the palace overall. And yes, there is this belief that it is a blessing or purification gesture, and related potentially to the date palm and the fertility or fertilizing of the date palm taking place. And then the headdress that they're wearing, the horned headdress, is the symbol that they're a divine being.
There's one up here.
Hi, I am very curious about how that Kalhu appeared on a Methodist church. I grew up in the Methodist church, and my congregation did not go in for Kalhus. Although you might find it curious that there is a Presbyterian church in Nashville which is dedicated in a very Egyptian style, courtesy of some women who had just come back from Egypt. But my Methodist church did not have any Kalhu.
So I can answer some of this, but not all of it. And some of it requires conjecture. So this is a copy of a relief that was in the Virginia Theological Seminary, and they acquired it in the mid-1850s. And you might recognize it. You might have heard of this exact relief, which was sold at Christie's in 2018 for quite a lot of money. So how did it come to be here? So it was in Virginia at a theological seminary, where they were acquiring it because they saw it as proof that the Bible was real, essentially, that if Kalhu is real, then the things that happened in the Bible were real. So why we have a copy of theirs in Baltimore, I assume that we wanted a copy of it for the same reason. But again, I haven't had a chance to talk to anybody associated with the church, but you two were telling me that there are other copies.
Right. There were several plaster copies made of it. Smithsonian had one previously. It's since been deaccessioned, like in the 40s. But I think there were a number of plaster casts made of it, maybe as an effort to try and sell it. But among the collecting institutions in the area, there were plaster casts made of that and other ones.
Go ahead, it's fine. Right, so what the executive director said was that plaster casts were often made for art schools, and so maybe MICA had something to do with it. I do wonder if it would be at MICA. I mean, the Peabody Institute also used to have plaster casts as well. Most plaster casts have dissipated, and so it is just kind of strange that this one appeared. But my guess is still that it belonged to the church. We have time for one more question. Jan, I can see Jan. And otherwise, you will be able to ask questions individually afterwards in the reception.
So I'm wondering whether, thank you for this really excellent program. And I'm wondering whether with all of the destruction and the interest in trying to regain their past, whether there is a movement to try and reclaim some of the Neo-Assyrian objects that reside in museums around the world.
I'm going to answer that in my personal capacity, based on my personal research. I think that it would be an amazing statement to be able to have any of sort of what's considered the monumental art return to its original location. I've seen Neo-Assyrian art in situ, where it was originally made and placed, and it has an entirely different feeling than it does in a museum context somewhere else. And so I can only say that from a personal perspective, having visited these sites, it would be really powerful to see it at home.
I don't know if you want to briefly state Michael's. Yeah.
Yeah, so some of you might have read recently in the news about Michael Rakowitz's request of the British Museum to return a lamassu to Iraq. The lamassu from the 4th plinth has been acquired by the Tate, and his argument is that now London has one too many. So we will see how that progresses.
And yes.
There is a really exciting development about this. So
Okay. We're going to take one more question. Apparently, it's late breaking.
statement, I think.
Okay. Okay.
Thank you. Sorry,
But does the individual have the microphone? Go for it.
Hello. Thank you very much for the lecture. Very exciting topic, a subject I love, very important to me. The piece that is on the slide behind you, I actually made that. With some other people as well. And that is no longer a Methodist church. It is our workshop, and it has been for maybe 7 or 8 years. That is a proof that was the second or third one that we pulled out of a mold that has a bunch of defects, obviously, a bunch of structural defects. But the final piece is an archival duplication and is currently on display at Virginia Theological Seminary. So prior to that piece being sold through Christie's, we made an archival duplication. And I spent a little more than a year of my life in 2019 making that in the final piece. And I could tell you the whole complicated story, at some other point.
Oh, please do. I mean, thank you so much. That's fascinating. That's amazing. That is the perfect way to wrap this up.
I wouldn't miss this lecture, obviously.
I thank all of the staff members who've helped make this possible, the Boshell Foundation, all of you for coming. And now feasting is an important component to many cultures across time and space. And while we are not welcoming you to a banquet, nor even to stand with the relief that was in the banquet hall, I do welcome you to go up one level if you're down here, or just out the door if you're up there, and enjoy a little reception with us where we can talk about this a little bit more. So thank you all.